All set. Great. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Bryan. I'm coming from the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University, and I'm here to talk about repurposing oil and gas wells for enhanced geothermal systems. So first, why are we talking about this? In the last decade, we've seen a really impressive amount of deployment of renewables such as wind and solar, which are really great at providing low cost and carbon-free electricity. But to fully decarbonize our electricity systems, we're going to need to balance out those resources with clean and firm electricity resources. These are generators that can either provide base load electricity or load following electricity to, smooth out electricity supply. Geothermal resources are one resource that can satisfy this need, and they have a number of other unique benefits. Geothermal typically takes up less land on the surface and creates more long-term jobs than other electricity sources. And geothermal presents an opportunity to transfer a lot of expertise, infrastructure, and technology that has been developed over decades in the oil and gas industry. Enhanced geothermal systems are a more emerging geothermal technology that have the potential to really significantly increase the amount of installed geothermal capacity around the world. But these projects have historically been limited by very high capital costs, most of which are attributable to the cost of drilling. And finally, there's actually a really nice presentation about this yesterday afternoon, but there's a huge amount of fossil fuel infrastructure all around the world that will eventually become retired or even stranded assets in the context of the energy transition. And a lot of this infrastructure can actually be repurposed in support of the energy transition. Uh, so specific benefits of repurposing wells for geothermal projects, the main benefit is cost. Drilling is the single most expensive component of any geothermal project. So any way you can cut down or remove the drilling and exploration costs is going to be hugely beneficial to the project. These are siting geothermal projects on former drilling sites is a way to also reduce environmental impact of energy development. We have low impact on pristine land since the area has already been developed and you already have a lot of infrastructure in place. This is just an image from Google Earth of a random well site in New Mexico, and you can see there are already access roads, there are power lines connecting the site, and there's already about an acre of land that has been fully cleared to support the drilling operation. As I mentioned earlier, these projects can directly leverage expertise, workers, and technology from the oil and gas industry. And importantly, these projects would be sited in the exact same locations that were previously used for oil and gas, which is hugely important to communities whose economies have historically been dependent on oil and gas extraction. And finally, this is an alternative to plugging and abandonment, which is the process that wells typically go through when they reach the end of their economic life. The primary purpose is to prevent methane leakage, but generally this is an expensive process that provides little return on investment. So we set out to answer a few different questions. First, by how much does repurposing wells reduce the costs of new geothermal projects? What is the total resource potential of repurposing wells, specifically for enhanced geothermal systems in the state of New Mexico? And finally, what is driving this amount of potential and the cost reductions from repurposing, and how can we improve on them? So New Mexico is the second largest producer of crude oil in the country, just behind Texas, and it's in the top 10 for natural gas production as well. And drilling activity in the state is really concentrated up here in the San Juan Basin, and then down in the southeast portion of the state, which is part of the Delaware or Permian Basin. So to answer these questions, first we develop a set of screening criteria to identify wells that have potential to be converted in support of a geothermal project. Then we apply these criteria to a public database of oil and gas wells across the state. Importantly, this database had a lot of good data, including depth and location, age, but it did not include temperature data, which is an important component of modeling geothermal performance. So we did have to estimate the temperature using the depth of the wells and the geothermal gradients in each location. Then we cluster wells into groups of 3 or more nearby wells for use in an enhanced geothermal system. Here you can see a typical what an EGS looks like. In the kind of base case, you have water that gets pumped down an injection well where it flows through a network of underground fractures and being heated up by the surrounding rock before it is pumped back up to the surface through multiple production wells and sent back to a power plant. And finally, we model the levelized cost of electricity of enhanced geothermal systems using if they were to be built using these well clusters. And we did this using NREL's system advisor model. And then we first modeled all the projects as if they were completely new drilling projects. And then we remodeled them after accounting for all the cost savings from the avoided drilling. Here are the set of criteria that we applied. So we start with a data set of 129,000 wells across the state. A lot of them had no depth data, which we needed in order to calculate the temperature at the bottom of each well. Then we dropped any wells that have temperature less than 100 degrees. This is because that's really the minimum amount of heat that you need to be able to generate electricity from a geothermal resource. Then we cluster the remaining wells into groups of 3 or more nearby wells that could potentially be converted into a connected geothermal system. Drop any wells if their depth is too different from other wells in the cluster, because if the depths are too far apart from one another, it'll be too expensive to connect the wells in the subsurface into one system. Drop older wells drilled before 2000. They're a little more prone to integrity issues and would be harder to develop. Drop any wells not on federal or state land leases. There are a few extra wells in the data set that aren't explicitly being used for oil or gas extraction. And then the last couple are more development related criteria. So dropping wells that are too far away from a transmission line, or wells that are in regions that are classified as having high biodiversity value or being important for climate resiliency. And then finally, after all the other criteria are applied, we drop any wells that are no longer in a group of 3 after we've dropped a whole bunch of other wells around the state. So we starting with our data set of 129,000 wells, we identified 543 wells across 113 unique clusters that have potential to be converted into an enhanced geothermal system. Importantly, this step right here is really where we lost the highest number or the highest fraction of the wells. Over 80% of the wells in the state don't appear to have temperatures that are high enough for geothermal electricity generation, but I'll come back to that a little later. Here's the locations of the wells before and after we apply the screening criteria. Most of the wells that are left are down here in the Permian Basin, which is a region that's really known for high levels of crude oil production. Once we identified our groups of wells, we have to model the performance and the costs of the geothermal systems. So here you can see all the various cost components of an enhanced geothermal system split up into a few different components. So you have your initial exploration costs, any test wells you need to drill. Then you have your full scale drilling phase. The field gathering system really refers to the pumps and piping systems needed to move the fluid around, and then the power plant itself. And once the project is built, you have ongoing operations and maintenance costs. Now, when you develop a system using repurposed wells, all of these highlighted components will either be significantly reduced or completely eliminated, uh, really reducing the cost of the project. So this right here are the results of our cost modeling. This curve here are the raw modeling results, so without accounting for any repurposing. And then these are the same projects once we account for the avoided drilling costs of using repurposed wells. This is a supply curve, so the projects are mapped from the lowest to the highest cost. We find across the 113 projects a total generating capacity of 361 megawatts. And the range of levelized cost of electricity is actually quite high, from $161 per megawatt hour to upwards of 700. And if you notice, all the projects at the high end of the range are really small systems, so either 3 or 6 wells in the system, whereas the most cost-effective projects are the ones that have either 9 or 12 wells, so much larger well systems that can have higher flow rates and higher power generation. And on a project by project basis, we find an average levelized cost reduction of 48.5% due to the avoided drilling costs. Here you can see the capacities of each of the projects. Generally, the smaller projects are just a couple of megawatts, but the 12 well EGS systems can reach just under 10 megawatts of nameplate capacity. Here you can see the range of costs and the range of cost reductions from repurposing. And we also see a correlation with the number of wells in the system and the scale of the cost reduction. Generally, the projects on the larger end of the cost reduction range are the larger EGS systems. Here we have the levelized costs plotted as a function of temperature. In general, the higher temperature you have coming out of the wells, you have higher enthalpy in the fluid entering the power plant. You have more harvestable energy, and you can also enable higher conversion efficiencies. So these are all important components in bringing down the levelized cost of a project. And again, the larger systems are also down at the bottom end of the LCOE range. And here we have the costs plotted directly against the number of wells in the enhanced geothermal system, where you can really see how the number of wells in the project influences the costs in a really important way. For standard greenfield projects, the drilling costs are as I mentioned, the most important component of the project. So they really become cost prohibitive as these projects get larger. But once you take into account potential cost savings from using repurposed wells, then these large systems really do see a significant reduction in their levelized costs. This is just a breakdown of the capital costs of representative systems of each size. So 3 wells, 6 wells, 9 wells, and 12 wells. These are the costs of a greenfield project, so with all the drilling costs included. And these are the costs of the system after we account for the repurposing. And the scale of the repurposing is much larger as the projects themselves get larger, just because of here you can really see how much the drilling costs dominate the capex of the project as these projects get larger. So as I mentioned, we dropped a lot of wells from the data set because they did not have enough or high enough temperatures to support electricity generation. Generally, you need at least 100 degrees Celsius to be able to generate electricity. So these red bars here are the wells from the full data set that we analyzed for use in EGF, which leaves this huge chunk of the data set with temperatures somewhere in the range of 30 to 100 degrees, which is not enough for electricity generation. However, there are a whole range of applications of geothermal energy that can make use of direct heat at lower temperatures. So this is a diagram from a Department of Energy report that came out a few years ago on geothermal potential in the United States. The wells we were looking at are here in this 100 to 150 C range for binary power generation. But a lot of other wells across the state be better suited to these agricultural, industrial, or building heating applications. So to summarize, we found that repurposing oil and gas wells for enhanced geothermal systems really significantly reduced the costs compared to identical systems using newly drilled wells. That said, the LCOE does remain high compared to other electricity generation technologies on the market, even after we account for these repurposing costs. This is really due to the fact that hydrocarbon reservoirs by their nature are cooler than typical geothermal reservoirs. So oil typically forms at temperatures of around 100 to 150 Celsius. Gas does form at higher temperatures, but it typically moves upward in the subsurface before it collects in a standard reservoir. So this kind of helps explain why these reservoirs they're not ideal for geothermal power generation, but they can still support these lower cost and lower impact projects. And although the costs are high, they can be competitive, especially on the lower end of the range when you compare them to similar sources of power that are both zero emissions and firm. So for example, solar plus long duration storage. I mean, today on the market, we really only have battery storage systems that are capable of running for 4 or 6 hours and are not really capable of, fully creating a baseload electricity plant from a PV facility. We also find that any efforts to develop enhanced geothermal systems using repurposed wells should focus on these regions where wells are most densely concentrated. And this is because the number of wells in the system has such an important impact on the economics of the project. There are a lot of regions in places like the Permian Basin where wells are, if you look from, above, you can see just kind of like a grid of regularly spaced wells in oil field, really high producing oil fields. So these are the types of wells that we think are really useful to target for enhanced geothermal systems. And although that only constitutes a small fraction of the total number of wells across the country and across the world, many of these wells exist in the temperature range that really are optimal for direct heating geothermal applications. And so we think that is really warrants additional investigation, with the caveat that for direct heating applications, you really need the end user of the heat to be co-located with the well, because it's much harder to transmit heat over long distances compared to electricity. And that's all I have, and happy to answer any questions.
So one of the talks yesterday about repurposing oil and gas infrastructure for new renewable developments, and one of the big questions that came with the consideration was the environmental remediation efforts and just cleanup. Like, who does that responsibility get transferred onto? So would that be included in the levelized costs, and what responsibility do you see for future geothermal development if that is the case?
Yeah, you bring up a good point, and you did mention yesterday that repurposing fossil fuel assets is kind of a way for can be a way for companies to uh, kind of deflect their decommissioning and remediation costs out into the future. Um, but I think that we see that these projects as a way for um, oil and gas operators to create a new revenue stream for their projects that does not generate emissions, and can can really support the development of a new geothermal industry in the same location uh, that has historically, had its economy dependent on oil and gas drilling. But you're absolutely right that environmental remediation and who's responsible for it, especially for like orphaned wells where there's almost no legal entity that's responsible for them anymore. That definitely is a huge concern.
Right, thank you very much. Um, I have other questions. Okay, so, you talked about oil, yeah, so we talked about geothermal going through the oil reservoir or the natural gas. Say, assuming that you're considering both horizontal drilling, fracking sites, well as say conventional. Uh, and so you're picking up, so, although it's depleted, and I assume that your ecosystem is taking up some of the natural gas until they is picking up some oil still there, and goes on thinking you were wrecking or getting wrecking cycle from the top.
Yeah, it's a great question. So typically the way that these projects have been proposed is that you would actually plug off the bottom of the well. So you would actually want to block off the hydrocarbon reservoir and be sending the fluid instead kind of through the cap rock, using stimulation techniques to open up fractures in the cap rock. So ideally, you'd actually be avoiding a lot of hydrocarbons in the fluid. And also, at these lower temperatures, you're using a binary cycle power plant. So the fluid that you're pumping up is not actually running through the turbine. It's just running through a heat exchanger that's heating a secondary fluid cycle that's running through the power plant. So the fluid that's coming up from the ground is actually kind of staying in this loop. Whereas you have another working fluid with a lower boiling point that is actually the working fluid for the turbine.
So it's all there. So if you're talking about cracking the cap rock on top of a natural gas reservoir. Well, what are the risks there that you're creating in capital for them to get the atmosphere?
Yeah, that is definitely a concern that all enhanced geothermal systems face. It really that as well as induced seismicity are the two main environmental concerns that are associated with EGS at this point. Um, and there have been a few kind of notable projects in the past that have had these environmental issues. They caused earthquakes, things like that. And the industry has really learned from those projects and developed a set of best practices that really mitigate them. One of the reasons that we dropped a lot of the older wells from our study was because those wells typically have more integrity issues and they're more prone to methane leakage, somewhere along the wellbore. And we were really doing a high level screening, just trying to identify, across the entire state, where are these wells located that are most ideal. But any of these projects would require really a site specific characterization of, the geology in that specific location. And really the oil and gas companies are the ones that have a lot of that information. They have the well logging and the core samples from each of their drilling sites. And so they're the ones that would really be able to answer the question of at each site, what are the risks?
Thank you.
Just a question in terms of the number of wells being considered with risk locations. Seems like you want to look at multiple three. Is there a reason?
Yeah, that was mainly a requirement of the modeling. The model that we were using assumes a ratio of the flow rates between production wells and injection wells that basically made it so that the projects needed to be in multiples of 3 wells. So in many cases, we identified clusters that maybe had 10 wells in them, and we just modeled them as a 9 well system. But in reality, you very well could create an EGS with 10 wells. You would just have to, modify your calculations a little bit.
You didn't just throw away the clusters that were not, so you just model them as other.
Exactly.
Thank you.